T-minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Bridge to the Future. My guest today is Jim Keravala. He is co-founder and CEO of OffWorld, and I will let him, in the course of our discussion, tell you more about that. So, welcome, Jim. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Frank. Pleased to be here.
So, I always ask everybody, how did you get interested in the space field, especially the development side, the commercial side? But are you one of those people who was interested in space exploration as a child, or was it something that came to you later in life?
No, I got infected with this bug as a kid. Actually, in my early years on high school, I read Malthus. We had economics doctrination of these sorts of principles, and it seemed to me very clear that Malthus was a 17th century economist who spoke about what happens with nation states as they expand and overexpand from a resource and logistics perspective in those feudal eras. And being such a space nut, generally having really reinforced the bug, I think, when watching Star Wars and so many different visions of where we can take civilization, positive or negative, and obviously we strive for the former. It did seem to me that a huge calling was, well, how do we open up the resources of the solar system and beyond so that we can flourish as a civilization and expand our ability to grow and not be limited. So this is very much a lifelong pursuit.
Hmm. It's interesting you mentioned starting with Malthus, because one of my mentors, Gerard K. O'Neill, was inspired by the limits to growth study in the early 70s. I think the limits to growth people would say they were not Malthusians, but they were accused of it, certainly. And in many ways, I think O'Neill was inspired by that, the way you were inspired by the concerns that Malthus raised. So,
exactly, yeah. And I think the challenge is, especially more so today, this week, this year, this decade, the questions of the limits we face as a civilization in our terrestrial sphere of influence and concern, it is almost the biggest question we can ask and requires the most urgency to address. And I'm not sure we are doing that intelligently and systematically, so that the most prudent and objectively viable solutions can emerge. Right now, I think we have a lot of groupthink going on, and the clock is ticking.
yeah. Well, you've tackled an area that I think does not get as much attention as it deserves, and that really is robotics and artificial intelligence. AI has certainly come into the consciousness in the last 5 months, but not so much in relationship to the space enterprise. How did you decide that your focus would be in this particular domain?
Yes. So my early years were spent on satellite design and launch, having worked on the launch of over a dozen spacecraft to low Earth orbit. And that after doing that for well over a decade. I needed to take it to a different direction, a more entrepreneurial direction. So I started several startups, learned a lot of lessons. The greatest, currency I gained was experience. But I gained a lot of lessons learned. And my previous startup to OffWorld, Shackleton Energy Company, the plan was for 6 of us to to build ice mining rigs on the south pole of the moon, take the propellant we need to get there, and effectively harvest and refine the propellant we needed to get back to Earth. So a real Lewis and Clark expedition that would set the premise of an in-space logistics, transportation, and propellant infrastructure. Now, we costed all over that over a period of a number of years to a $18 billion program. This is from 2008 onwards. And it was very difficult to raise capital for something like that. So, but I went out naively with my co-founders to push that premise and test the premise, really. Eventually, we did raise some initial funds from a sovereign leader who was keen to expand into a proposal for an entire space-based solar power architecture around the planet by before the end of the century. Excuse me. This would involve setting up the propellant supply chain, the lunar manufacturing for scalable space solar power built outside Earth's atmosphere, and then the establishment of that architecture over the subsequent 50 to 60 years. After about a year of significant mobilization, that also fell apart under its own weight. There was risk reduction exercises, and it was too much to lift. But we came close. We came very close to establishing the world's most significant and important infrastructure program in human history. And that fight is not over. We are still mobilizing on that. But I drew out several lessons from that. One is there's no such thing as a space business. There's only business.
Yeah.
So however grand or altruistic or important the mission might be, if it doesn't meet the metrics of scaling economics, there's no way you can mobilize funds from the early and late majority of capital providers who will care about what you're doing but won't back it financially. So you need to be smart. So that was the first lesson. And the second lesson I kind of drew from this was you have to prove things. You have to lead the way and prove things out before others will follow. So having an idea or having a vision is part of the picture, but you need execution and implementation to close the cognitive dissonance gap. So building it was then clear to me. So when I decided to bring my efforts at Shackleton Energy to a close, I thought, well, what are the real lessons learned? Well, there were two main areas to that. The first was, for an ideal space industrialization program, for it to be economical, viable, startable, and scalable, there are 4 constraining categories. You had to have no people present in situ doing repetitive command and control work, whether it was physically manipulating tools, remote controlling, or even teleoperating from a distance. The second is, because of that, you should ideally minimize any fixed infrastructure. Don't try and build fixed infrastructure in the early days. Thirdly, avoid or minimize the consumables you need and just use what you can locate locally. And the fourth was leave no environmental footprint, not just for good practice and good cultural ethics, but also electrostatic regolith is something you want to avoid flying around. And so with those 4 constraints and adding that there's only real business that can mobilize scaling, I then proceeded on a long search for the nearest planet with aliens with bank accounts. So it happened that we are actually sitting on a very viable celestial body. And if you build a space program that is environmentally agnostic, your systems development, your hardware, software, intelligence layers, and interface to human operations will be consistent from a systems perspective. And it's only the environmental deltas that you need to engineer for and account for. So in order to build civilization out into the solar system, into the stars, we knew we needed to be able to undertake mining and harvesting, processing and fabrication, construction and manufacturing, the foundations of industrial endeavor. So we designed and architected a single platform. We looked at nature. We architected a swarming configuration of robots that are modular in their archetype, use common subsystems, power, comms, data handling, articulation, software, command and control, intelligence, etc. But the modules can be interchangeable, and any function that's necessary for the building of industrial civilization can be built with this industrial Lego kit, a solar system toolkit, if you like. And so we created a subset for the mining sector called the Swarm Robotic Mining System, and literally went and banged on the doors of some mining companies and managed to find an excellent kickoff partner in one of the big mining companies who, although being skeptical, to immense credit, they gave us the chance and opportunity to prove ourselves. And with that great relationship, we managed to kick off what we're building and expand it to other companies. And we have just signed a major lunar mining contract last week. And the press release of that will go out mid-April.
That's great.
So we're actually the world's first company to have mining development contracts on 2 celestial bodies.
Well, congratulations on that. That's really great. A couple of comments on what you just said. There is no space business. I think you said there's only business. And I went to an MIT conference maybe 7 years ago, and one of the speakers, whose name I don't recall, said, if you want to be successful in space business, drop the word space. And kind of what you just said.
Yes.
Very similar. The other thing is, I think really we need to realize that the Earth is the first space community. Here we are. We tend to dichotomize Earth and space, and I think it's a big mistake. And I think you've seen that, and that's the sort of the business plan in a way.
And you know, I mean, Frank, it's such a good point you make. I mean, I believe this generation now has possibly, from certain aspects, I mean, every generation holds its own, but from certain aspects, we have the greatest responsibility in the entire history of human civilization and possibly for the future of human civilization. And that responsibility is this, that the very nature of how we flourish and expand off our one embryonic planet, the culture, the practices, the best practices, and the intent that we move out into the solar system with may have lasting effects for generations and millennia on the nature of human growth into the galaxy. And it's, you know, we look around the world today and always and see how hard it is to rise to our better angels. You know, we're a complex species driven from a DNA imperative for survival and resource gathering and risk reduction. And yet our hearts and minds build communities and reach out and reinforce our social fabric. but we have the protective envelope and cocoon of our atmosphere, our gravity, where we can play up and act a little more ridiculously, and the consequences are localized.
Yeah.
In space, when we don't have that protective envelope of our beautiful Earth with the atmosphere and the lands, even the smallest discord that transpires into physical interaction can become a weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah.
A single firearm discharge in a space station could cause extraordinary and widespread loss of life.
Right. Yeah.
So we have greater responsibilities to be better consistently than we are here.
Absolutely.
In order to move into space, we go through a pinch point of cultural inversion and have to build new rules that allow for longevity and sustenance of flourishing in the most vulnerable of environments, both psychologically and physically.
Yeah.
You know, the further we move away from our beautiful home, the greater the challenges, especially multi-generational, that will emerge of identity, of culture, of belonging, of a sense of who we are. And by establishing principles, the highest ideals and principles of our humanity, and as much as we can without being creating doctrination, but as much as we can establish a set of ideals of the best of our nature, even though we may not be able to ever reach them, we always know the North Star to which we need to aspire.
Right.
And I think that will be important to establish this generation.
Very well said. And on the practical side of that, you mentioned how unforgiving the environment is. You know, I actually discovered your thinking in a YouTube video. And in that video, you talked about how it really doesn't make sense to send humans out first to the moon and Mars to build the infrastructure, that it should really be autonomous robots, intelligent systems who could prepare the way for the humans. I'm wondering, do you still think that, and could you talk about it a little bit?
Absolutely. No, thanks for raising that reference, Frank. Very much appreciated. If we take a look out the window at our cities and our infrastructure and our communities, we see an end-to-end value chain and supply chain of commodities, food, transportation, infrastructure, security, power, water. You need that whole chain. You need the whole system for humans to be able to start operating comfortably, where you can dismiss some of the lower hierarchy of needs as commoditized process, so that creativity and value creation can then be the focus of operations. In space, I don't believe the last 75 years of the exploration paradigm is what we must follow for the next century or so of expeditionary paradigm. And let me explain that. For better or for worse, I believe the free market is the truest representation of our ability to transact value as a species. We need to create infrastructure and systems that allow us as rapidly as possible to enable market forces to take root and for the generation of economic value to be realized. So in order for that to happen, you need a significant number of people, and a significant number of infrastructure in place. The only way that we can really mandate human-based exploration is through national agency-based programs. That's so far, and it doesn't look like that's going to change in the decades coming soon. And I say that with slight humility, because we never know, the tremendous efforts of SpaceX and the enormous efforts that I know Blue Origin are making, and others are certainly pushing that envelope. But the reality is that we need to be able to send dozens to hundreds of people to a location to create critical mass of transactional capability and economy. In order to do that at pace, if we take the human astronaut approach and the human operator astronaut approach, with the necessary machine tools, we are looking at a surface-based establishment on the moon, because you'll basically have surface pods and station components to create a surface base, maybe covering it with regolith for security, radiation and micrometeorite security. But for the most part, it will be a base mentality. Where I see the real liberation of growth occurring is if we send robots out first. Let's talk about the moon. And with minimal additional hardware or accessories or consumables, we have our robots, which we have our robots doing now, terrestrially, to be able to excavate underground, under the lunar surface. Once you can commoditize the ability to create caverns, tunnels, atriums, you can build cities, and you can continuously do that and have multiple species of robots then undertaking the subsequent layers of refinement. So you have the first robots as excavators and haulers. Then you will have robots that undertake finishing and shotcreting or lunarcreting. You may have robots that can establish conduits and piping. And so you get all the base underground infrastructure, even to the point of establishing airlocks, air, water supply, and basic food material. So what I want to see, and what we must do, is OffWorld is building its robotic capability for its in-space solar system toolkit to the point where we can build infrastructure on the lunar surface and in free space, both in compressive gravity and tensile microgravity build environments, so that the astronaut can open the airlock, close it, walk inside the new habitat, take off her helmet, breathe the air, drink a glass of water, and then get down to work on taking it to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of constraints as to what is possible and when. And I'll just go quickly through a few technical constraints. Machine vision and interpretation with small data, as opposed to large data image classification, is a critical area of research that needs to continue. And there's lots happening. Meta just came out with a new segmentation tool just a day or two ago, which is an extraordinary value add. So all these technologies are emerging rapidly. The ability to increase the performance density of processors and machine intelligence, the establishment of the correct infrastructure of swarming species of robots heterogeneously collaborating, built on a modular architecture. OffWorld can check this one. And then dexterity, robotic dexterity, bringing that together so that the tooling, whether it's additive, construction, manufacturing, fabrication, or subtractive, excavating, digging, crushing, beneficiation, whatever's required, the dexterity of the tooling is at the right level. So, for example, fine manipulation of, let's say, for medical robotics or some other intricate work may or may not be available today, but in 10 years, it has an increasing likelihood to be robustly available. But whatever that level of dexterity is, the human astronaut or operator or resident can then take that next level onwards, being slightly flippant, whether it's putting curtains up on the skylights or whatever, or making it their own, or the creative aspects, the human factors for continued living. It will be super critical. Mm. And so we absolutely are pushing to have our robots being completely capable And OffWorld is the only company really that is operating commercially, terrestrially, undertaking the analog industrial sector activities on Earth, building revenue, refining and improving our products as we get ready to mobilize them for in-space utilization.
How intelligent would the robots need to be? Are we close with the artificial intelligence we have today? Because I'm thinking, from my understanding of your vision, they're going to have to be pretty autonomous when they're out there.
I would delineate between autonomy, intelligence, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. There's a lot of the devil's in the detail. We actually don't need to put optimizing machine learning and reinforcement learning everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to create general artificial intelligence or AGI, artificial general intelligence. We can in fact cheat with our architecture of modular speciated robots working together. The production cost of the robots lowers to the point because we're using common modules like a big Lego kit, industrial Lego kit. The cost of operations, or the cost, capex and operations cost of these robots are low enough that you can create many of them so they can collaborate together. But then you can also cheat a little on that autonomy, because you can now afford to have one species of robot do literally one or maybe two tasks, but do that very well. So the sensors, the kinematics, the tooling are all really focused on optimized for that. But it doesn't mean we had to design a new robot for that, because we just took the parts and configured the parts of the robot from our kit.
Uh-huh.
And now that means we're not trying to push the envelope on intelligence layers too greatly. Although OffWorld is leading the way in heterogeneous swarm intelligence for these industrial grade robots, this is a true game changer that can change how we do industry here on Earth. When you've got hundreds or thousands of individual units with some agent-based ability to then determine tasking, and collaboratively swarming, and we operate in comms and GPS-denied environments. So that is really like it is the same effect as a group of individual people working at a task collectively.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
So this is the first time this architecture has ever really emerged in a non-human form factor. Mm. And so I think we can certainly achieve the early stages of that infrastructure build on the moon with the levels of technology we have now in 2023. It would be slow. It would be clumsy. It would not be economical to do, but give us another 3 years. By the time we getting ready to deploy our first pilot programs on the lunar surface, I think the combination or the spectrum of these technologies and our ability to wield them will have improved. And a subsequent 3 years after that, we're going to be in revenue generating zones.
That's great. Yeah. So building on this whole business model of starting out on the first space community, as I call it, do you see other opportunities other than mining? It seems like mining is where you're focused now. Whether you're doing it yet or not, what would be another application that would be testable here on the terrestrial plane and then later on the moon or elsewhere?
So, Frank, it's a prescient question. Thank you for asking this. So, for example, let me share one context of how we're treating this much more as a holistic activity than as an individual sector premise. If we're excavating ice and harvesting water ice on the moon, and not only water ice, but the end-to-end materials and minerals from the bounty of the lunar regolith, the last thing we want to do, as I mentioned earlier, was to jeopardize those operations by being disrespectful of the land, by not operating in harmony with that environment, which has not only a truly ethical perspective of higher ideals to operate, but it makes practical sense. In space, an enlightened cultural approach to how we operate makes good business sense, because then we're not covering our machines and eventually the people with this dangerous electrostatic regolith dust. On Earth, if we look at mines today, I mean, as OffWorld, the OffWorld team have been doing this. We've been in mines all over the world, deploying robots, undertaking experiments, and refining our art. It is a tough, brutal, unforgiving environment that few of us in the urban world really see firsthand.
Yeah.
And we are doing this all over the planet in order to meet the consumer demand of our ability to even have this call remotely. It costs the planet for us to grow technologically as a civilization. When OffWorld is deploying its mining robots, for example, we've been working with some potential customers defining an end-to-end holistic system of robots that would operate with the mining robots to re-green and recultivate, and if you like, garden the environment around it. So our robots would operate like a swarm of ants inside an ore body, so we wouldn't do surface mining, and we would process underground. So we would try and limit the amount of ore that we take out and only bring out ultimately just refined mineral. So we should be able to reduce the environmental and energetic environmental cost of operations in mining by orders of magnitude. And then we would have other robots that could plant trees, curate the ground above, move excess rubble and dirt, and as we're mining and excavating, continually garden the environment around it. Now that is a game changer for the whole nature of mining, as an example.
Right.
And now if industrial processes could leave a net positive in the environment, we turn things around on their head.
How do environmentalists feel about your mining efforts? Have you talked with them or given them the imagery you just gave me, which is highly environmental in tone?
We exhibited at COP26.
Yeah.
We were proposing a series of underwater robots built on our Swarm platform to harvest the ocean for plastic. An architecture that could, over a 30 to 40 year period, harvest the plastics out of the ocean, and we'd use those plastics and reconstitute them into high grade medical ethanol, basically the high value products that could be sold at the premium necessary to undertake such an operation. There was a lot of interest for that, a lot of recognition and understanding of our terrestrial mining robots and what we're trying to do. And again, as I mentioned earlier, good intent, it's human nature that the best of intent does not translate to an investment outside of, or a commitment outside of business practice and principles.
Right.
Even the most altruistic stakeholders will always look at the bottom line to protect their asset base. And I think that's prudent, so that they can continue doing good. There are some who will give away the base of their capital, and that's a great choice as well. But the majority operate within those constraints. So I think there's been a lot of environmental support from those, let's say, with an environmental focus. It so happens that the execution of progress happens directly with the stakeholders who have the most financial interest. So currently that's the mining customers. We have several contracts on the space side, but we are really looking to get to a mining production capability to start churning robots out by the end of 2024.
How do you think the investment environment is for the industry as a whole right now for space tech? Do you see it as still positive, or it seems like there's been a bit of a pause lately?
It always takes bold investment leaders to operate in the space sector. Not only does it possess technical challenges, it is also pre-market ignition. So most other sectors that investors will operate in, they can look to mature market economics, huge addressable markets, millions of users and end users, and can create a little more of a quantitative assessment of risk.
Yeah.
Space investors have to ante up a little more guts and metal as they make those decisions based on assumptions of where the market will go and when it will come.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's always been challenging. The majority of investors follow a herd mentality. So they try to reduce risk, especially on the venture side. They'll attempt to reduce risk for their limited partners by looking at what the brand investors are mobilizing in, and then usually jump on that and, move in those syndicates. In this current environment, and for the next 6 to 12 months, the economic uncertainties for terrestrial markets are still very high, relatively, in terms of terrestrial investments. The irony is that for space investments, the risk profile is not so much different from a technology base. In fact, what happens is the risk to space company fortunes increases during these periods, not because of any change in technical risk or market risk, but in a risk of literally just runway risk. So for example, with terrestrial investments, your markets might collapse. Look at Zoom or other social media or communication tools that flourished during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And as the economy has contracted, the user base utility has changed, and so the investment thesis from the market framing is reduced. The investment thesis of market for space doesn't change because it's still not there. There's no change to that. So actually there should be a lot more consistency to space investment, irrespective of economic fluctuations, as long as the space sector is pre-market ignition.
Mm-hmm.
Once there's market ignition, then all those entrepreneurs had better operate and start thinking robustly, because it will then be very demanding and unforgiving.
Mm-hmm.
From OffWorld's side, we're very fortunate because we are operating across reasonably resilient frameworks of value creation.
Yeah. So overall, what would you say, if you can sum it up, what is your capital market strategy at this point?
Demonstrate and expand our swarm robotic mining architecture into the mining industry. There is literally hundreds of billions of dollars of industrial opportunity for redefining how we mine on Earth.
Yep.
What OffWorld is building is the direct route to be the leading industrial powerhouse of in-space mining, construction, and manufacturing in the 2030s.
Mm-hmm.
So it's our motto here. One of them is first terrestrial and then celestial.
I like it. It's understandable and simple. So
and look, I think it's difficult to say where the space market in whatever real form, not the Earth-facing segment, but the pointing out to space, where that really starts. I think it's at least 10 years away before you have a real closed end user supply chain.
yeah.
I think there'll be some early government customers who'll want strategic reserves and some accessibility. There'll be some one-off and early stage commercial and high net worth engagements. Space stations, Axiom and others may start creating some stream of income this decade through their primary activities in space. And these will all be the pillars on which we build. But the ignition point for end-to-end operations, I'll be pleased if they happen in the first half of the 30s. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes some time approaching 2040 or late 30s before we really start seeing the emergence of self-sufficient value chains.
Mm-hmm.
Our advantage at OffWorld is that we are already operating in a mature market past the second inflection on the S-curve,
Right.
but with a complete blue ocean of opportunity that hadn't been considered before because of where our origins of thinking about space infrastructure. Whenever that market ignition occurs in space, we're not betting our company on it.
Yeah.
But we'll be ready to reap it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, as we're speaking, it's April 8th. I just read that on Monday, April 10th, Starship may get launched into orbit, or it may not. Our friends at Starbridge Venture Capital talk a good bit about the Starship singularity. They think it's going to change quite a lot if it works. What do you think? Is that a descriptive phrase, or is it off? Is Starship going to make as much difference as we think?
Heavy reusable station to low Earth orbit and back is the biggest game changer in the space industry in human history. Henry Hertzfeld of George Washington University wrote some papers back in maybe the last century. Henry might not be happy for me to say that, but he wrote papers about the inelasticity of launch pricing. Did a lot of analysis of how it might take hundreds or thousands of launches to really lower the cost between that 10,000 pound kilogram to low Earth orbit threshold, plus or minus commercial or government pricing. I think the rationale and premise for those sorts of assumptions in a mass optimized engineering culture were reasonable. When you build a vehicle that is fully reusable, has so much payload capacity that you can sacrifice a portion of that payload capacity for your return propellant to the Earth's surface, and you still have more free payload capacity to low Earth orbit than a dozen other launch vehicles combined. Every business can now switch its thinking from mass optimized spacecraft engineering to cost optimized. It's not how many ounces you can shave off your spacecraft to optimize your launch pricing and make your mission affordable. It's now how do you generate revenue and profit and add value and service commercially, rapidly, and robustly as quickly as possible. It just so happens that OffWorld has been operating under this premise for the last 7 years since we incorporated, because we're serving terrestrial industries. But Starship will enable the opening up of, or let's say the accessibility of economic fortune to anyone who wants to provide it. Talking about a singularity, I think is a good way to put it. Imagine us being on the East Coast in the 1800s and having no way to get to the West Coast. Not even if we walked or took a donkey.
Yeah.
Or let's say we can take some expendable donkeys. What we have, the analogy is cliched, but Starship really is the first railway.
Yeah.
It really, if it works as the SpaceX team under Elon's leadership advocate, it will really be the first railroad, because you can ride the train in one direction and you can return it back where it started in the same configuration.
Yeah.
Once you restack it. And this is everything, and it's perfectly designed for OffWorld. we'll be filling up starships with our robots
Yeah, yeah,
as possibly one of the first full load customers.
yeah,
We'll probably be amongst the first customers for Starship that would purchase the entire capacity. They'll be our galleons
yeah.
heading to our new.
I'm sure Elon is happy to hear that, or would be happy to hear that. Yeah. Um, as an entrepreneur, is there anything in particular that keeps you up at night? Is there something that worries you, that as
Yes,
you look ahead?
yes. How to be the greatest service to my team. That's not being trite or false modesty. We have the most amazing team. So how do we make sure that they have a clear road ahead to do everything they need? And on the wider side, I've spoken about this for at least a decade, that we may or we may not have a window of opportunity as a civilization from an energetic creation capacity. Our ability to reach forward, to leap, to aspire to greater things, to look up, to push the frontier are all privileges based on the hard work of the majority of the population keeping systems running, sometimes under duress, sometimes under stress with limited resources, living tough lives, building for their families, but creating a fabric that allows a few of us to jump and see if we can grab a foothold on the stars or a handhold. The window of opportunity is that there may be environmental, energy, geopolitical, water or food-based resource challenges, and then subsequent cascading intersections of those that not necessarily causing any existential disaster that causes a species risk, but enough of an economic risk this decade
Right.
that policy, investment and resource capital, motivation and incentive and mandate to keep pushing forward and upwards start to meet greater and greater headwinds.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe our entire environmental policy as a global civilization under the United Nations is misguided. There is the intent and the sincerity of the intent is absolute. I think some of the opportunistic exploitation of that seed intent is obvious, and it's very visible. And the challenge is that the window of opportunity that we have to address not only a potential climate issue, but mitigating against other risks that could cause equally severe impact.
Yeah.
We're not addressing any of that on the scale we need. And the biggest one is energy. Right now we talk that the energetic solution is to get off hydrocarbons and use renewables. The amount of mining and manufacturing we would have to do into the hundreds of trillions of dollars of infrastructure to do this, based on the only available energy source right now, which is hydrocarbon, on top of our normal economic civilization's energy needs, would probably push us off the climate cliff, even if we tried it.
Yeah.
A time scale that is only possible if you create totalitarian mandates and eliminate liberty and freedom. So we are in a real dichotomy. The only real solution, in my view, in scaling, and I hope I'm wrong. I'm wrong about most things in life, so I hope I'm wrong about this as well. In my view, the only real solution at a civilization scale is for us to push for Kardashev 1 type civilization to be as systematic and effective as we can in our energy usage and our production. And the only way to do that is to produce the energy our civilization needs outside of Earth's delicate environment.
Right.
Move off the energy production industrial architecture out into space, build
Right.
it using lunar and asteroidal resources,
Yep.
build 100 terawatt space-based solar power architecture to power the Earth and inner solar system, and start that now, get to gigawatts by the 30s and get to terawatts by the 40s and 50s, and scale from there. We won't solve the climate crisis this generation. I don't think that's a battle we can win.
Yeah.
But we can build the foundations and create the infrastructure to allow Earth to flourish in the 22nd century as a greener, balanced environment with a capable in-space economy, colonies and settlements, people expanding and opportunity growing. And meanwhile, we would have saved the planet from multiple microclimate issues and created an existential risk mitigation against human demise.
Yeah, I think Elon calls it the great filter.
Frank Drake.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Can we get through that great filter? And those of us who are old enough to have been young when Apollo happened, there was a moment where that window of opportunity seemed to be opening and it closed. And I remember that experience dramatically. And so I know it can happen where you feel like the momentum is there. We're going to go and we're going to do it. And then it closes because of other considerations.
Absolutely. And this time we cannot let the opportunity slip. There is no chance. We have to be insistent. We have to be rude, but we have to be intelligent and rational. People have to listen to both sides of the argument. And the way to think about this, I believe, is in order to encompass the widest dialogue, is to think of it as a hedge, as insurance. We don't do anything if we're sensible without some investment into insurance, whether it's driving a car, medical, house, or going on holiday. And yet we don't have an existential humanity and Gaia-sphere and Anthropocene insurance.
Yeah.
Building a space-based solar power architecture and the in-space industrial mobilization that it would require would be the greatest liberation of existential risk from humanity's shoulders in the history of our species.
Mm-hmm.
And we must make a start on it this generation in the next 10 to 20 years, which has zero lead time. So we have to start that and continue that this week. OffWorld is already working on that, and many other teams are. We have to continue that and thread together that narrative and that message that all these separate activities that are occurring are not just for some sort of economic benefit. They're not some playground of billionaires. This is the absolutely most important fabric of humanity's protection, envelope of protection that this generation can do.
Mm-hmm.
No other power generation and energy generation industry can build the terawatts of benign energy power we need and do that without mining on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope we don't miss this opportunity. It can be painful to do so, to miss it. Our time has gone really fast, Jim. I just would like to thank you for your time and ask any final words. Are there questions I failed to ask that you'd like to answer? And just give you a moment to tell us your response to that.
Well, no, Frank, this has been a very enjoyable conversation. I really appreciated it and the thoughtful questions. I think you covered so much and allowed us to have a conversation on many important topics. I would just say that, from my team's perspective, what we're doing, we are embedded in of what I consider to be one of the most important missions on the planet. We have a pathway and a plan, and are executing on that plan to robustly undertake that plan using market forces. So there's no hope. There's no false hope. There's no expectation of miracles. We're just building on robust, straightforward business economics. And through that pathway, we know we're going to build a road to the stars. And we're very excited by the future. I'm excited by the future. And despite all the challenges that are in front of us, despite the risks that we face, all of us, I think more so now than ever, the opportunity is huge. The potential is now within our grasp, at our fingertips. And I think also our maturity as a species to start thinking about how best to go out into space, how best to mobilize this enormous bounty and opportunity on behalf of all of humanity. How do we do that the right way so that we can lead that way, and we can act as an example to the generations that come to create that best sustainable growth of human civilization into the solar system, onto Alpha Centauri, and then beyond from there.
Well, I can't think of anything to say that would build on that or improve on that, Jim. So I'm going to thank you so much and say, yes, let's do it that way. And it is exciting and certainly worth getting out of bed every morning to take on this enterprise. So thanks again. It's been great.
Thank you, Frank.